Okay, hi all. This is my first time I'm seeing you guys in person this time. Doing this video for you. Sorry it wasn't last night. I just got too late and I couldn't get to it. But I wanted to have a little discussion because I know some of you are having problems with calculating GDP and finding good videos. So first off, let me put it to you this way. The GDP calculations we're going to run through today are theoretic calculations. What we're doing is we're imagining a small economy. In the real world, if you read the GDP primer that I posted online, what you'd find is that we're going to do the same thing for a huge economy, but we're going to keep things simple. And the problem is, normally there's an accounting problem, not accounting as in the subject, but accounting as in keeping track of. There's a kind of accounting problem in having problems in these GDP calculations. So let me just run through a little model for you, and then I'll have some discussion about GDP deflators and then price indices. If people have more questions, they can ask them online, and I'm more than happy to expand upon the GDP deflator conversation and price indices conversation. But I just want to give a little intro. And then I'm going to conclude with a discussion of just the particular problems you were asked in problem set and where just technically some of you might have gone wrong. In fact, if you think you might just have a technical problem, not a calculation problem, you might want to fast forward to the end when I discuss those problems. It'll probably be in the last 5 minutes of this video, just guessing since I haven't covered it yet. But sometimes people just have a short technical problem with the problems, as in, how to say this politely, you're not reading the problem appropriately. The problem's asking for something and you're trying to give more information. So let me start by saying, let's imagine a simple, what we're going to call a two-good, 2-year economy model. And I'm just going to use my whiteboard, and I'll show you guys the whiteboard at various times to lay it out. But that's what I'm doing when I'm drawing, and I'm just going to do it as I go. And I've got my trusty little calculator. This is all you need to keep track of things. That way I'm not doing it in my brain and ending up with a miscalculation error. But you know, if you've seen my other video from my YouTube channel, you might have recognized, if you were astute and paying attention, that I actually made a mistake in that video. It's very easy to get confused with all of the terms and the dates and the items and the years, and to get things backwards. So let's hope this time I don't actually get something screwed around, and let's keep it straight. So I'm going to choose very simple numbers, very simple quantities. Remember, in the real world, we expand out against all of the newly produced goods and services in the economy and all the possible prices they're offered at. But we're going to assume a world where there's one price per item for that year, and the prices change on a yearly basis. A very, as I said, theoretic economy. So let's start with an economy that just has guns and butter. These are the only two goods. So guns and butter, G and B. And what we're going to need for both of these goods is, if you've taken microeconomics, we're going to need to be able to calculate the total revenue for these goods, or the price times the quantity, to sell how much was sold in a given year. So we want to know prices, and we'd like to know the quantities. And I'm going to use P of G, subscript G at the lower, and Q of G to represent price of guns and quantity of guns. And then I'm going to use price of butter, so P of B, and Q of B for the quantity of butter. And as I said, I'm going to do a 2-year model. So we're going to do year 1, and I'll use Y1 for that and Y2. And all I'm doing is creating a table of data so we can use this to create our calculations. So let's say the price of guns in year 1 is $10. And let's just say the price of guns in year 2, it doubles. Let's just keep it simple. It's $20. Quantity of guns sold in year 1, let's just say that we sell 100 guns. And the quantity of guns sold in year 2, let's just make that 150 guns. Not quite double. Let's do the price of butter in year 1 as $1, and the price of butter in year 2 as $2. And let's just call these pounds of butter. And quantity of butter sold in year 1 is 1,000. And the quantity of butter sold in year 2, we're going to be very boring, 1,500. It's very symmetrical. So this is the data I've laid out for you, that we're going to base all of the calculations upon this data set. So we're going to use this data to calculate what we're going to calculate. So let's start with our basic definition. So nominal GDP, which I use this superscript N, that's a superscript N, nominal GDP first off, we want to calculate it for both years, year 1 and year 2. And what do we mean by nominal GDP when we're economists? What we're really talking about is today's prices, today's quantities. So every time you see nominal, think today, or in the case of this model, this year. So nominal GDP in year 1 is year 1 prices, year 1 quantities for everything in the economy. So what we're really going to have is the price of guns in year 1 times the quantity of guns in year 1 plus the price of butter in year 1 times the quantity of butter in year 1. So we end up with our formula for nominal GDP, which is just year 1 prices, year 1 quantities for every good in the economy. And as you can see right here, I label the price of guns as a PG, and the year is in the superscript up top. So then I plug in my information from the top up here, and I'll just fill this out. So this will be PG1, PG2, QG1, QG2. And the same thing with butter, PB1, PB2, QB1, QB2. Okay, so I'm going to put, all I did was label the items on the graph in terms of what they represent. So I'm going to plug in those numbers. So I plug in 10 times 100 plus 1 times 1,000. And I'll use my calculator, even though I can do this in my head. And we do 10 times 100, and we end up with 1,000 plus 1,000, which is equal to $2,000. So our nominal GDP in year 1 is $2,000, and that's the math on it. Hopefully that's bright enough for you guys to see. Okay. And when I'm done filling this whole board, I'll leave it up for an extended period of time so you can copy it down. I'm going to do the same thing for nominal GDP in year 2, except now I'm going to recognize that in year 2, my prices and quantities are year 2 prices and quantities. So I want the price of guns in year 2 times the quantity of guns in year 2, plus the price of butter in year 2 times the quantity of butter in year 2. And I'm going to do the same thing and put in the relevant prices and quantities. So I get 20 times 150 plus 2 times 1,500. And I use my handy dandy calculator, and I find out that 20 times 150 is equal to 3,000. And then I find out that my 2 times 1,500 is equal to 3,000. And 3,000 plus 3,000 equals 6,000. Okay, so now I'm going to use a formula from math, and I'm going to use this formula a lot so we can see it once, and maybe in the future I won't write it down as in detail. But we're going to do the rate of change, and there's different variations on this, but I use something called the net -oh. So if we want to calculate the rate of change, ROC, rate of change, of nominal GDP in year 1 to year 2, what we're really doing is we're calculating the percentage change between the years. We're going to use this formula, which is just going to be ROC, and this is my own lingo that I'm using, 1 to 2, equals, I call this the -oh, so the new minus the old divided by old multiplied by 100 to turn it into a percentage. So we're getting what, as I said, the calculation. New, old, old. As I said, there's different variations. If you learned a different rate of change calculation, you can use it. So in this case, I'm going to put the newest year, which is year 2 for this model. So I'm going to calculate this as 6,000 minus 2,000 over 2,000 times 100 to get my percentage change. And what I get there is 200. And what we're saying is this is a 200% change. In GDP, if I did my math right. Okay. So double, triple. Yeah, what we're really saying is that we've had a 200% increase in GDP. Sounds about right. That's pretty huge. It's unrealistic. It's never happened in recorded human history. But as I said, we're keeping the numbers simple. That's why we're doing a lot of doubling. So we shouldn't be surprised. In the original problem, prices doubled. Quantity went up by 50% for guns. Year 1 to year 2, prices doubled and quantities went up by 50%. And so what we're really getting is the weighting between those things. So let's see. Okay. So now we want to move to real GDP. So remember, if nominal equals today's price and quantity, all I wrote, today's price and quantity for nominal, then we're going to go to real, and real GDP is what we're going to call a constant price index. So real equals constant price, meaning we hold the price constant and today's quantity. So what we're measuring in real GDP is we're going to measure changes in quantities and we're going to hold prices constant. Because if you remember your definition of GDP, the definition of GDP is that as prices, the GDP is the value of real goods and newly produced goods and services produced within boundaries country over a period of time, normally 1 year. Well, if we want to compare year over year and we want to know whether we're producing more, right? What we're really concerned with is the actual production. Then real GDP lets us look at, are we making more items? When we're comparing nominal GDPs, we might not be making more items. We just might be making items that cost more money, right? So we could have conceived a world where the price of guns changed, but we only produced 100 guns. Would you say that the country's wealthier because there's just more expensive guns floating around? Or is the country wealthier because there's more goods produced? And what we're really getting at here is something called the real side of the economy. The real side of the economy tries to abstract away other factors like the financial sector and inflation and things like that. Just a sec, I'm going to go see. I think I have another marker over here because I think this marker's not doing too good. So just a second. Lots of permanent markers in here. Probably best not to use the permanent. Well, we might have to live with that marker if I can't find another dry erase marker, but it is what it is. Not much I can do. I'm limited by my scarcity of my resources. That's a really bad economics joke. So, you know, is what it is. Okay. So we're stuck with this one. It should get us through. Time to buy some more. One more thing to look at. I've got glue sticks. I have erasers, tapes, scissors, but apparently no more dry erase markers in my office. Well, whoever knew we needed this many permanent markers? Yeah. Okay, so when you do real GDP, what we're doing, we're holding prices constant. We're not going to let them change. So we're going to keep the price the same. And what we do is we call this the base year. And to make it easy, base years can be any year. But for this example, we're going to use the base year as year one, the first year. So year one becomes the prices that we use always. And I'm going to go up to my table at the top and circle those year one prices to remind myself that those are the ones I use. So the formula for real GDP in year one is the price in year one of guns times the quantity in year one of guns plus the price in year one of butter times the quantity in year one of butter. Now, if you're following along, this should look very similar to what we did in nominal GDP for the formula for nominal GDP. So I'm not going to insert the numbers because they're exactly the same. And this leads us to our first truth. So real GDP for year one will be $2,000. Well, for your base year real GDP is where your prices are held constant at that year one. So for any base year, real GDP and nominal GDP equal the same number in that base year because what you're holding constant is prices. So if your nominal GDP for year one is being calculated and your real GDP for year one is being calculated using base year prices of year one, then they're going to be the same number. Year two real GDP, we calculate as the prices of guns in year one times the quantity of guns in year two. We've now deviated in the price of butter in year one, because remember, we hold the prices constant, and the quantity of butter in year two. We're going to plug in our numbers from above, so we get 10 price in year one times 150 is our quantity in year two. Then we get price of butter in year one is 1 times the quantity of butter in year two, which is 1,500. We're going to plug this in and we end up with 10 times 150 is 1,500, but let's just verify so I don't make a mistake. And 1,500 plus 1,500 is 3,000. So now we can go through and we can calculate our rate of change of real GDP from year one to year two to actually see how much real GDP, how much more quantities are being represented in the economy. And if we do this, we're getting the rate of change from year one to year two of real GDP, and we're going to use the NITOO formula. So we get the new is 3,000 minus the old 2,000 divided by the old 2,000, multiply times 100, turn it in percentage, and we end up with 50%. Now this is a big change. That 50% is a big change from the amount we calculated of 200% change before, but it shouldn't really come as a surprise. That 50% change reflects the fact that for guns from year one to year two, the percentage change in quantities was 50%. From year one to year two, the percentage change in quantities of butter was 50%. And I did this because I kept it simple. What we're really doing is calculating the weighted average of quantity changes, and the weighting metric is our prices in the base year. So if you ended up with really expensive items, they would reflect higher as quantities go up in the value of real GDP. So prices turn into a weighting mechanism to tell us how important the quantities are for our discussion. So let's imagine something costs a penny and we sell 1 million of them, right? So, you know, a penny in 1 million, we take off the 2 zeros, was that $100,000 worth of GDP. If the prices go up 400%, we go to 4,000%. Now, that could, you know, if we let that equally weight in our GDP consideration, then that would overvalue the items because they're 1 penny items. What we want to keep in mind is that in GDP, we're weighting by the relative prices. So items that cost more and sell larger quantities have more value in the relative weighting. And if that doesn't make sense, it's not a big deal. But what I want to really illustrate is you can't just calculate the percentage change in quantities and weight them equally, because the weighting mechanism really is the year one prices that tell you how the relative value of items for the economy, right? It's actually a combination of the value and the quantities produced. Items that cost lots of money and sell in large quantities have more importance for the economy than items that are low priced and sell in high quantities. And likewise, items that are low priced large quantities might have, or not, more importance for the economy than high priced items that don't sell in the economy. So there is some relative weighting that's occurring. And what we've done is nominal GDP, once again, today's prices and quantities, real GDP, we hold prices constant. And here we have a clean example of what's going on and how to calculate the rate of changes. And what we're actually measuring. We're measuring in real GDP changes in quantities weighted relative to prices in the base year. What we have in nominal GDP is just what's the value of everything today. And, you know, as we've shown, normally real GDP rate of changes are less dramatic than nominal GDP rates of changes, that 200 versus 50% change. There's one other measure that I do, that's a little different from most textbooks, and I'm going to erase this now, except for my data at the top. So give me a second here while I do that. And the last weighting is something you don't end up seeing in a lot of textbooks. In fact, I don't even think it's in your textbook, but I think it's a valuable intermediate step that's kind of consistent with the model that we've developed here. And so that's why I do it, even though it's not the norm. I do it for consistency, which probably is a bad reason. So I'll just fill these back in. Okay, so we end up with 10. Okay, so now I've got my table. Now I produced this metric, and it's called a constant weight price measure. You're not going to find this really anywhere, and I'm going to calculate for year 2 and year 1, constant weight price measure. And weight is just a stand-in for weight is quantity. So one way to think about it is a constant quantity price measure. Here, instead of holding prices constant, we're going to hold quantities constant. Now, if you read the CPI and the inflation primer that I put up online, what you should have seen is that when the government calculates market baskets of goods, they hold what constant? They hold the quantity of goods or the weighting of the basket the same. And all they measure is price changes. And what we normally call this is inflation. In fact, when we measure real GDP, we're not measuring inflation, we're measuring change in production of real goods. When we measure constant weight or constant quantity price measures, or we measure a price index like a consumer price index or a producer price index, what we're doing is we're measuring for price changes in the economy. Now, I did put up some videos and some readings on why our measures of inflation might not be great. And obviously, if you guys want, I could do another video on it, but with summer time's a little short. So just ask and I can do it. So what we do here is we use constant quantity, same quantity, today's price. And we're going to use, once again, our base year could be any year. What we're going to use a base year of year 2 just to model what it looks like to have a different base year than we had before. So our constant weight price measure for year 1 is going to be the price of guns in year 1 times the quantity of guns in our base year. And our base year, and I'm going to circle this, is year 2 quantities. So we hold constant at 150 guns and 150 or 1,500 butter. So I just circled those. So it's price of guns in year 1 times the quantity of guns in year 2. Then we get plus the price of butter in year 1 times the quantity of butter in year 2. We're going to input things in, and we get $10 times 150 plus $1 times 1,500. Looks very similar to what we did before, but we're doing something a little different. And we end up with $10 times 150 is 1,500 again, so we end up with $3,000. Year 2, we end up with price of guns in today's prices, so year 2 times quantity of guns in the base year price. Quantity guns year 2 plus price of butter in year 2 times the quantity of butter in year 2. And remember, we changed the base year. Now this should look a lot like our formula for nominal GDP in year 2 because we're using today's prices and quantities because the base year is here. But we'll plug this in and we get 20 times 150 or 3,000 plus 2 times 1,500 or 3,000. And we end up with 6,000. We do our rate of change from year 1 to year 2. And we take new minus old over old. Times 100. And we end up with 3,000 over 3,000, so 1 times 100 or 100% change. We've doubled our prices. Now I'll leave this up for a sec so you can see what I did there. But now this shouldn't come as a big surprise because if we look at our prices, it is a little artificial because I changed the base years and we tend not to think about going backwards in time. So what we're really measuring here might be a little more confusing. If we had measured with the base year of year 1, what we're really measuring is the inflation from year 1 to year 2. But now because we put it at what's happening in the past, what we're really measuring is we're still measuring inflation from year 1 and year 2, but we're looking at it from today's perspective versus last year's perspective. In fact, I'll do a little academic exercise and see if we change the base year, if our rate of change changes. So let's do a model with base year of year 1. Can't hurt. So we end up with CWPM 1, CWPM 2 equals, and we're going to use that year 1 now quantities. So we end up with price of guns in year 1 times quantity of guns in year 1 plus price of butter in year 1 times quantity of butter in year 1. And this ends up looking a lot like nominal GDP for year 1. In fact, exactly the same. So we end up with 10 times 100 or 1,000 plus 1 times 1,000. So we end up with 2,000. Then we do constant weight price measure year 2 is the price of guns in year 2 times the quantity of guns in year 1, because that's our base year, plus the price of butter in year 2 times the quantity of butter in year 1. Because we're holding those quantities constant, we end up with 20 times 100 plus 2 times 1,000. It's going to be 2,000 plus 2,000 equals 4,000. So if we do our rate of change, year 1 to year 2 equals new is 4,000 minus old 2,000 divided by 2,000 times 100, and we end up with 2,000 divided by 2,000, which is 1 times 100, which is 100%. What it shows us is that our price change from year 1 to year 2 still, or our inflation, our raw inflation, is 100% still. So we doubled our prices, right? So it doesn't make a difference which the base year, your inflation calculation is exactly the same. It's just whether you're looking in retrospect, using last year's prices as your base year and seeing where they moved, or using this year's relative to last year and seeing what's changed. Either way, you're measuring inflation. That's a good proof of concept. I've never actually worked through the math to see. That's why I decided to do it. Plus, it gave you another chance to see this example again of how to calculate these things. And here's where we're actually measuring inflation. Now, if we did this for every good in the economy and held all the quantities constant at some level, this is what we call a market basket, or to construct a price index. This is the New Jersey Market Basket Sentiment Survey, or New Jersey Market Basket Survey, or some of the other big CPI surveys. They just throw all the goods in society and say, let's weight how much we spend on these to determine what's happening in the economy. Now, I said I was going to put a little mention of price indices and of deflators, and then if you guys had more questions, you could ask, and I can do another video. So first off, let me draw you a little picture. When I think about, so I'm going to show you two formulas and a little picture, and I'll explain them while I have them up. So let me draw them. First off, GDP deflator is equal to nominal GDP for some year, let's call it year 2, divided by real GDP for some year, let's call it good 2. Times 100. Some textbooks leave 100 out, but I always include it in. So what's important, if we're calculating real GDP, we need to know what the base year is. So if the base year, let's say that hypothetically the base year was year 1, or sorry, year 2. Let's start with the easy case. Then if the base year is year 2, that's going to imply, so let me show you what I've written so far, just the formula for GDP deflator. And if the base year is year 2, then nominal GDP is the same as real GDP in year 2, and that means that we have the same number times the same over the same number, which is, if you take two numbers that are same and divide by each other, you equal 1, times 100. So this is going to be 1 times 100, or the GDP deflator is 100 or 100%. Some books use percentage, some don't. They treat it as what's called an index or a price index, which is based on 100. So what that tells you is, for your base year, your GDP deflator is always equal to 100. For your base year, your market baskets, your CPIs, any of your price indexes, producer price indexes, are always 100. So if you're measuring a GDP deflator for year 2 and your base year is year 2, then nothing's changed. Now, in the second case, if your base year is year 1, then that's going to imply that, and let's assume there was some positive level of production increase, that's going to imply that the nominal GDP is going to be, for year 2, will be bigger potentially than your real GDP for year 2, right? Because the prices went up, we're assuming, on some of those goods, and the quantities went up, but the prices and the quantities went up. So that means normally nominal GDP is bigger. And what we think of when we think about a deflator is we think about a balloon within a balloon. And what we're really thinking about is the ratio of real GDP to nominal GDP. We're thinking about how big one is relative to another. This is my very crappy drawing of two balloons within a balloon. And what we're doing is we're calculating the ratio of how much real GDP is filling that nominal GDP to tell us what the deflator is. By the way, those roles could switch, and the real GDP could be bigger than the nominal GDP. It's happened in history. So You really need to look at your data to see what you're doing, but you're looking at the ratio, whatever you calculate. So if we go back to our first example, just off the top of my head, if I remember, nominal GDP in year 2 was 6,000. Using base year 1 prices doesn't make a difference because it's nominal. So we were looking at 6,000 divided by, and correct me if I'm wrong because I erased everything now, but real GDP was going to be holding prices constant. So we had 10 times 150 or 1,500 plus 1 times 1,500, so 3,000. So using base year 1 prices, I think off the top of my head, nominal GDP was 6,000, right? Because we had, I think I'm wrong about my nominal GDP. Anyway, you guys can tell me, or I can go back later and look what it is. But let's just imagine that nominal GDP had been 6,000, and real GDP based on base year prices was 3,000. Whatever we calculated, you do the nominal for that year divided by the real GDP for that same year, multiply times 100, so that ends up being 200 is your GDP deflator. Now, what are we learning with GDP deflators? And what I'm going to be honest is not a lot and yet a lot. So I'm not a big fan. GDP deflator is one of our measures of inflation along with consumer price indexes, CPIs, or producer price indexes, PPIs. I'm not a big fan of GDP deflator because it includes everything, but that's the other reason it's good. It includes everything. GDP deflator really is our only measure of inflation that tells us for everything in the economy, what's the relative value of what we produced relative to price changes, right? And it includes all goods and services. So it's our most broadest indicator of what's happening in the economy. The other reason I'm not too fond of it is a lot of textbooks use GDP deflator to do something like this. And so they say, look, imagine you want to take inflation out of nominal GDP. You can use this equation, which is real GDP equals nominal GDP times or divided by the GDP deflator. And depending on your econ textbook, times 100 or not. So the idea is we can manipulate that basic formula and we can say, look, if you know the GDP deflator and you know nominal GDP, you can calculate real GDP. The problem is it's just a little artificial because real GDP is something we calculate. Nominal GDP is something we calculate. We use those two things to calculate GDP deflator. So it becomes a math exercise is how I think many economists use this problem. And they say, look, we're going to give you a table. We're going to give you 2 variables and 1 unknown, the unknown being real GDP. And you're going to use this information to calculate real GDP. But in the real world, if you're a government statistician, you would have already calculated the real GDP and the nominal GDP and then calculated GDP deflator. Why would you ever need to use a GDP deflator to calculate real GDP? Now, there is some example where you could say, look, well, what we could do is if we knew the nominal GDP for some year in the past, and we knew the GDP deflator for that information from the past, then we could calculate real. But it's very, I don't know, maybe you guys don't agree, but it's very artificial, I think. And that's why I'm not too fond of these kind of mathy exercises, math for math's sake. You guys are intelligent. My course, anyway, has a math prerequisite where you should know how to manipulate algebraic expressions already. Why do I need to test you on something that really is unseemly and not what an economist would do? You're going to calculate the GDP deflators from that other information. Rarely are you going to have the deflator information without the other information in the real world. It does allow you to do some fun problems of calculating, say, the income of Babe Ruth in the past and what it looked like in today's dollars. But you know, other than those type of exoteric things which you could do through other mechanisms, I don't see the real value in knowing that. But you know, anyway, you can manipulate that equation however you want. It's algebra. Manipulate the math. Go for it. Have fun. So that's all I want to say about GDP deflator. And as I've said, not my favorite measure, but it is an overarching measure. One of the reasons it's also not my favorite is GDP has some inherent problems. So does calculating any inflation index. Where when we measure GDP, we might, well, you guys can watch the videos, but we might not be looking at some of these things that we're concerned about, like valuing women's production in the household, valuing environmental damage or crime damage equally as other types of damage. So there's some problems inherent in GDP calculation to begin with. GDP deflator takes the problems inherent in GDP calculation and then multiplies them to create an inflation measure that has flawed matrices behind it. The reality is we want to admit that there's problems with GDP and inflation calculations, know that they exist as economists, but then we want to say, look, but it's the best we have for now. But we need to keep in back our mind, there's always a problem with calculating GDP, there's always a problem with calculating inflation. When we get to price indexes, the same general principle is going to hold for a price indice. When you're constructing price indices, it's always going to be that same type of relationship that GDP deflator has. So I'm going to give you the generic form. Price indices are always going to be equal to some nominal basket or calculation divided by the real, multiply times 100. And once again, if your base year is your nominal year, then you're dividing the same thing by the same thing. So it's a 100. And so for any base year, the price index always equals 100. Okay, so that's really all I want to say about that. But for any base year price index, it equals 100. So as I promised you, I was going to tell you the secrets to this homework problems. So first off, you've got two problems where you're given data sets on ice cream and a few other things. You guys know better than I because I haven't done the problem in a year or so since I first posted it and figured out solutions. So what you need to do is pay careful attention. The first problem is proposing that you literally just tell me what is the P1, what is the Q1, what is the P2, what is the Q2. You don't actually calculate anything. All you do is go up to the table and you say the price of ice cream in year 1 is $1. The price in year 2 is $2 or whatever. And the base year for that problem, pay attention to what it is. I believe it's year 1 for that problem. I'm not positive, but I think it's year 1. The second problem after that looks very similar, and a lot of people jump ahead. So first off, some people in the first problem try to make the calculations and put them in. That won't work. You just put in the numbers from the table. The second problem, you're going to do the calculations, but the base year changed, so you have to use a different base year than you did for the first problem. So you can't use what you the formulas you developed in the first problem to calculate the second one. You have to develop a new set of formulas for some of the items. If that isn't clear enough, ask. I can go into more detail, but normally that's enough of a hint for students to do well. So I'm going to conclude this by saying, look, it's summer session. It's very impacted, 6 weeks. We're almost halfway through. You guys are doing awesome. I'm busting my ass trying to get the exams graded, hopefully over this July 4th weekend so that you can see the grades from first exam. Second exam is going to open on Monday or probably Monday. I'm going to put that out there. You'll have the week to do it like I gave you this past time. The second one and the third exams aren't going to have anything that I grade. They're going to be graded by the computer this time. So you'll know right away how you did. But I like to take that opportunity on the first exam to actually see how you guys are thinking, see what you guys are writing in problems. Just rest assured, I believe on the first exam it's out of 40 or 42 points. 20 of those points, I believe it's in your class, 20 of those points are almost half your grade is something that I grade. So if you're getting close to 22, and you guys can go look at the point structure on the exam if you had noticed it while you were taking it. But if you're looking at your grade, then you need to think in terms of, you know, scoring 22 is that perfect score on what the computer grades or whatever the appropriate number is. And so if you're in the teens, 15 or above, you're doing pretty okay, in my opinion, on that exam. Other than that, things looks like we're doing an okay job, other than one mistake we had with the CD player shoes assignment, where the grading got done backwards, and she wasn't giving partial credit. But we'll correct that as quickly as possible, although my priority is exams right now. But other than that, looks like we're getting things graded as they come. Try to do the grading after everyone turns it in. I don't like answers floating around while other students are still working. Although sometimes if I give people excessive extensions, a lot of people don't turn things in on time. We'll play it by how many people have turned in the item before we start grading, so we're not wasting too much time going back tracing down who hasn't submitted yet and things like that. As always, if you have a question, ask, I'll post and give you guys a clue as to what to do. And if I'm falling behind, that's fine. Just give me a phone call if I'm not getting back to you quickly enough via email or another mechanism. Summer session's really intense. Neither here nor there for you guys, but I was elected to a position here on campus that I did not realize some of the time commitments over summer, so maybe I would have taught one less class, which wouldn't have been good for some of you, but it is what it is, because no one else teaches online in econ except me at this campus. You know, so my time constraints have really, you know, this morning I had a 6-hour-long meeting until I came here to do this fun video with you guys, which I would have rather have done earlier in the day. So have a good 4th of July weekend. And if this is another semester and I'm recycling this video, then have a good day. Bye.